a so-called peacekeeping mission? Thanks.
Also, what we need is peace in Ukraine, and therefore Russia and President Putin has to stop the war, withdraw its forces. We support all efforts to find a negotiated solution. We support all efforts to find a diplomatic solution. And of course, we support and welcome the talks and negotiations which are now taking place between Ukraine and Russia. At the same time, we support Ukraine because we know what they can achieve on the negotiating table is, of course, very closely linked to the situation on the battlefield. So I strongly also believe that one of the reasons why the Ukrainians also are saying that they have seen some steps in the right direction is because they have been able to fight back. They have been able to fight back against the invading Russian forces. So the courage, the determination and the support from NATO allies to the Ukrainian armed forces is extremely important also when it comes to what they can achieve as part of the negotiated process with Russia. Again, of course, we support peace efforts. We call on Russia and President Putin to withdraw its forces, but we have no plans of deploying NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Okay. Rai?
Secretary General, good evening. Can you comment on Italy's role in this current crisis? And happy birthday for today.
Thank you. I would very much like to comment on Italy's role. Italy is a highly valued NATO ally, a founding member, and Italy is contributing to our collective defense in many different ways. I was recently in Romania. I met Italian pilots. They are helping there to keep NATO airspace safe, and they really show commitment and strength in their contributions to different NATO missions and operations, including in Kosovo, where Italy has been a key ally for many, many years.
Financial Times. Yeah, gentleman with glasses. Yeah.
Thank you. Just to follow up to the question about the peace talks, you said that you're encouraged by signs and that you support any effort to find a diplomatic solution. Could you tell us, are you seeing any signs on the ground that the Russians are genuine in their approach to these peace talks, or that they may well just be using them as a distraction for resupply and for restructuring their approach? Thank you.
On the ground, we don't see any sign. And that's the reason why we also call on Russia to engage in these talks in good faith. And it's not for me to report from these talks. NATO are not part of those talks. These are talks between Ukraine and Russia. But I've just seen the reports coming out from those talks. I think it's very important not to speculate and not to prejudge or to preempt any outcome of these talks. But my message was in a way that it is obvious that what Ukraine can achieve around the negotiating table is very closely linked to the situation on the battleground. And therefore the support we give to them to stand up against and to resist the Russian invasion also helps them to achieve an acceptable outcome in the negotiations.
Associated Press?
Lorne Cook from the Associated Press. Could you tell me a little bit more about the tasking that you've given NATO commanders, what that might involve? And are we looking ahead 1 year, or are we talking about a decade, something longer term? And you also used the word persistent. I wonder what that means. Why wouldn't you say on a permanent basis?
This is the way we make these kind of decisions in NATO, is that the politicians, they set out the guidelines, the direction. Then we task our military commanders to give advice on how to follow up. And then we make final decisions as politicians based on these advice and input from our military commanders. This was exactly the same we did back in 2016. When we, at the Warsaw Summit, made historic decisions for the first time in our history to deploy NATO combat troops to the eastern part of the lines. You have to remember that before Ukraine, also before the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 by Russia, NATO had no combat troops in the eastern part of the lines. Then we had illegal annexation of Crimea. And since 2014, we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. Tripling the size of the NATO response force, establishing the battle groups in the Baltic countries and Poland, more presence in the air, at sea, and of course also started to invest more, increasing defense spending. Then the process was the same. The politicians tasked the commanders, they provided advice, and based on that we developed the final conclusions that Allied heads of state and government made at the summit in 2016. And then since then we have implemented that. I foresee a similar process now. We have tasked the military commanders. We will have their advice within weeks, and then my ambition is that heads of state and government, when they meet at the end of June, can make the decisions on significantly increased presence, reinforcing our deterrence and defense on land, at sea, and in the air. And of course, this will then depend on the input we get from the commanders, but also, of course, at the end of the day, it has to be a political decision by the leaders. So the decision I foresee within months, as meaning by the summit in June. Then implementation will, of course, vary a bit depending on what kind of decisions we are going to make.
Frankfurt Allgemeine, just behind AP. Just behind.
Thomas Kutschka, Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. Secretary General, is there anything in the NATO-Russia Founding Act that could restrict military planners and commanders when they work out these options for leaders? Thank you.
Also, we will do what is necessary to make sure that there is no room for misunderstanding in Moscow, for miscalculation in Moscow about our commitment, readiness to protect and defend all allies, every inch of NATO territory. And the reason why we do that is not to provoke a conflict, but is to prevent the conflict. That has been the success of NATO for more than 70 years, that any potential aggressor or adversary has always known that an attack on one ally will trigger a response from the whole alliance. And to ensure that in a new security reality, we need a reset of our deterrence and defense. And that's exactly what we're now tasking the commanders to provide advice on, how to reset our deterrence and defense, and we will do what is necessary. The NATO-Russia founding treaty, of course, that actually has a clear reference to in the current security environment back in 1997. We are not in the current security environment today. We are in a total different security environment. At that stage, we actually foresaw Russia as a strategic partner, working with them. Since then, Russia has invaded Georgia, illegally annexed Crimea, and now also invaded Ukraine. So we will do what is necessary, and the NATO-Russia Founding Act is not something that will create problems or hindrance for NATO to make the necessary decisions.
Okay, we go to Ukrainian news agency.
Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. There in negotiations with Russia is another important factor. According to the data released today from the General Staff of Ukraine, around 40% of invading forces already lost by Russians in equipment and manpower. Could NATO confirm that? And because of that, the obvious question, is the threat which Russia posed to NATO in escalation a little bit overestimated by NATO countries? Thank you.
President Putin totally underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces. President Putin underestimated the unity of the Ukrainian people and the courage of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership. And this, combined with the support, the massive support the Ukrainian armed forces are receiving and actually have received from NATO allied countries over many years, have forced President Putin to change his plans and to realize that this quick victory, this blitzkrieg, taking control over Kiev within days, has absolutely failed. But we should not underestimate Russia's capabilities when it comes to continue the war and also to continue to attack, including cities. We have seen how Russia has been responsible for the same, or for brutal warfare, both in Chechnya, but also in Syria. And of course, even though they have made severe mistakes, Russia maintain a large capability of conventional armed forces, but Russia, President Putin has also, they have also used nuclear rhetoric. Russia is a nuclear power, and we have seen how they have stepped up to also the nuclear rhetoric threatening both NATO allies and Ukraine. So I think we must not underestimate the dangers related to the military capabilities of Russia, including their will to actually use force and impose devastation and destruction on others.
We'll go to Imedi, lady in white there.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Mr. Secretary General, can you tell us more about Georgia? Defense Minister from Georgia attended the ministerial, and you have, and you said recently that it's a broad agreement that we need to do more to support Georgia. So, what options were discussed, for example, today? Thank you very much.
I think we need to realize that we are faced with a total new security reality, which of course affects the people of Ukraine. It's devastating for them, but is also putting more pressure on also those countries in our neighborhood who are not members of NATO, not members of EU, countries at risk. And Georgia is one of them. And the Georgian defense minister attended the meeting. All allies listened very carefully to his intervention, where he stated the challenges Georgia faces, being a country which has already seen the consequences of aggressive actions by Russia back in 2008, and other attempts by Russia to interfere in Georgian domestic affairs. So the message, one of the lessons we have to learn from what is going on in Ukraine today, is that we need to support these countries which are at risk now. It's better to support and help them now than after a military intervention. So if anything, I think we now see the value of the support that has been provided to Ukraine before the invasion, but also the importance of that we could have done even more for Ukraine. And then I think that the message for Georgia is that we should step up, provide more support, and send a message that we support the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Georgia, not only in words but also in deeds. And therefore I call on NATO allies and others to provide support to Georgia. And that was the message also from allied leaders at the meeting today.
Al Jazeera.
Secretary General, we're 21 days now into this conflict. Based on Russia's performance militarily so far and your current intelligence, can Russia win this war?
I think we should all be careful speculating too much. What we have seen is the strength and the courage and the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces, which has impressed the whole world, and which has been able to slow down, to fight back against the invading Russian forces. And I pay tribute to the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian people in the way they have been able to stand up against the invasion. But at the same time, Russia remains a formidable military power. They have many different types of weapons. And therefore, I think it's too early to speculate about the outcome. What we need is Russia to stop the war, President Putin to withdraw its troops, and then to find a political solution. That's what I would say about that.
Okay, we'll take a last question. Polish TV, lady in black and white there. Thanks.
I would like to go back to this special summit of NATO in upcoming week. Could you say what is the special reason to organize this summit, especially that on June we will have a regular NATO summit? So could you tell us more about this? Thank you.
President Putin has underestimated Ukraine, the people of Ukraine and the armed forces of Ukraine and the political leadership of Ukraine. But President Putin has also underestimated NATO, because we reacted swiftly and unified in a way that has imposed severe costs on Russia. Together with partners, the European Union, NATO allies have imposed unprecedented economic costs. We have provided and continue to provide essential support to the Ukrainian armed forces. Allies do that every day. And we are also increasing the presence of NATO in the eastern part of the alliance. So President Putin's aim was to divide NATO. What he gets is a more united NATO. He wanted to, in a way, to undermine the nation of Ukraine. He's actually strengthening the unity of Ukraine and the commitment to the Ukrainian nation by the Ukrainian people. And then he wanted less NATO on its borders. He's getting more NATO on its borders. So to do all this, we need to be coordinated. We need to consult. And therefore, the day after invasion, we had a virtual NATO summit with all the NATO leaders, extraordinary NATO summit. And we will have an extraordinary NATO summit next week in person here in Brussels to continue to ensure that we are united, that we are closely aligned, and that we act together, both when it comes to providing support to Ukraine, when it comes to coordinating our efforts, when it comes to imposing costs on Russia, but also when it comes to taking the necessary decisions to ensure that we send a clear message to Russia about our credible deterrence and defense, both in the short term but also in the longer term, including by starting the work to reset NATO's deterrence and defense.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference.
Thank you.